Good afternoon, and welcome to our eighth and final lecture on how we got the Bible. Today, we're going to be talking about the English translation of the Bible. And of course, the Bible has been translated into lots of other languages, and each of them deserve the attention of how the Bible came into that language. But I don't know all those other languages, and I don't know all those histories. So we'll end with the history of the English Bible. But before we talk about the Bible translations themselves, we need a little bit of history to appreciate the events and appreciate the language situation. And so we're going to have a very brief summary of the pertinent history. So first off, Christianity is probably introduced to the island of England somewhere in the 2nd or 3rd centuries AD. At some point in that time frame, Christian missionaries made it to the island and began teaching the native Celts about Jesus, and some become Christians, and the Christian teachings begins to take hold there. In the 5th and 6th centuries, the Anglo-Saxons were actually from the main European land, and they're a Germanic tribe settling in England in the 5th and 6th centuries. Often we'll call people from England Anglo-Saxon, but ultimately they come from Germany, and English is actually a Germanic native language. There's a major change of power and a major cultural language change around the 1050s AD because of the Norman conquest. There is this debate on who should come to the throne, who had the right to the throne, and so there is a war that arises, and we won't go into all the details, but it ends with the people of Normandy succeeding in conquering the land and claiming the right to the throne. And in these time periods, there's been 3 major eras of English. The first one, really when the Anglo-Saxons start to settle in England and the land, and they are mixing the Celtic language with the English language, is Old English. And Old English, which lasts from about 450 AD to 1050, again because of that Norman conquest, is far more like German than anything we say today. If you heard Old English, you would have no clue what anyone was saying, and you would think they were speaking German because it sounds so much like German. And if you wanted to read something in Old English, you would have to go learn the language first and then go read the text. But that was part of the English history, was this stage of English. The second part is starting really with that Norman conquest. With the change of culture comes a change of language, and so you have a period called Middle English. It's still quite a bit different than modern day English. You would recognize more words by sound. The language still looks different being written down, but you would recognize more words by the way they sounded. The days of Shakespeare and around the 1600s is actually the start of modern English. So the 1600s to the present is called by linguists the modern English age. Who knows when they're going to decide we are in a new stage of English, as most people today think the language of Shakespeare and the King James Bible does not sound like their language today, but it is far more like your language than either Old or Middle English is. So let's talk about some of those first attempts to translate the Bible and the Bible stories into English in its various forms. And so don't think of these translations as always into something that you and I would be able to understand today. But the first attempts were probably made by a guy named Cadmon. And he really wasn't attempting to make a translation. What he actually was doing, he was taking the stories from the Bible in Latin and writing songs in English that could be sung and understood. And he's the first person that we know of that has seemed to have done anything like that, taken anything from another language about the Bible, brought it into English so it was readily understandable to the people he would be around. A little bit later, in the later 600s, a guy named Aldhelm made an effort to translate the book of Psalms. For whatever reason, the book of Psalms seems to be the first book that gets translated when it is coming into English. That might be one of the reasons why the book of Psalms seems to have such a strong connection to people who speak English, but often the book of Psalms is the first one they attempt to translate. And note, he's translating this into Old English out of the Latin. The Bible was basically the Latin Vulgate in the Western world at this time, and so that is their reference point. A little bit later, the Venerable Bede is supposed to have translated the Gospel of John literally on his deathbed, that he finishes it the hours before he passes. History has not been able to verify whether that is true or not. There have been no copies that have survived. But it's a pretty consistent story that has been told for a long time, and I think most scholars take it as possible that the Venerable Bede may have indeed done this. Moving a little bit further into history, up toward the 900s, a king who decides to make religious reforms, become very serious about God, and he starts requiring certain worship and certain kinds of activities and outlawing and making laws against certain sinful conduct. In part of this religious reform, he begins to translate Psalms and several other sections of the Bible. That guy's name was King Alfred. He dies around 901, and he was known partially for his victory. Sometimes he's called Alfred the Great. He had several wars and conflicts he had to forestall, as well as several cultural and religious reforms that he instituted. A little bit later, around the 10th century, again in the 900s, you have an abbot named Alfred who is enlisted to help translate more portions of the Old Testament. He's a little bit resistant. He's afraid that his translation is going to be misused by the English speakers and misunderstood by the English speakers to approve of conduct that is sinful, but he does. The picture here is actually a picture of the Tower of Babel, and it's from a Latin excerpt of the Hexateuch, and Alfred translated part of Genesis. So he's connected to this picture and part of his translation. And that's basically the end of the Old English efforts to translate. So by the end of this, you have the first 5 books of the Old Law translated. The Hexateuch includes Joshua in that. That's why it's called the Hexateuch and not the Pentateuch. So you have some historical Old Testament, you have Psalms, and you have Gospels. And when the Norman conquest happens, in addition to changing culture and language, it basically stops any future efforts for a long time of translating the Bible or parts of it into English. And it's really not picked up again until 2 guys, William of Shoreham and Richard Rolle, around the 13th and 14th century, do some work on Psalms. And that's basically the situation until a guy named John Wycliffe. Wycliffe is a vitally important character in the history of the English Bible. He was an Oxford professor who was known for opposing papal oppression, sometimes called a champion of the people. So the taxation of the Roman Catholic Church, when they would encourage, some people would say extort others out of their money, and you have these situations with the indulgences going on that eventually upsets Martin Luther. Wycliffe saw that as a problem as well. And so he sees the Roman Catholic Church as not actually following the Bible. And so he starts this effort and completes it to translate the entire Bible from Latin into English. This is the first full English translation of the Bible. And again, this is still in the Middle English time period. You could read significant portions of this, but some of it will be hard for us to read. And it is not from the Greek, as we translate today, but from the Latin, because that's what we had access to. Now, he very likely didn't probably translate the whole thing, but he did oversee the project. And he actually gave his copies to a group called the Lollards, or the Poor Priests, who would teach the Bible in English and teach the gospel in English. And this began to be a thorn in the side of the Roman Catholic Church, to the point that after his death, his bones are later dug up and burned because they declared him a heretic. But this sets the stage for a guy named William Tyndale. Tyndale is known as the father of the English Bible, and the reason is he sets it as his life's goal to translate the Bible into English from the original languages, not from Latin. And for that reason, he goes to study at Cambridge. Now, before Tyndale went to study at Cambridge, a guy named Erasmus moved to Cambridge to be a professor of Greek in 1511. In 1516, Erasmus becomes the first person to print the New Testament in Greek. Again, the inventing of the printing press in the mid-1400s changes the world, and he's the first one to take the New Testament and compile the New Testament books and print a Greek version of that. The reason that's significant is that it's very likely Tyndale studied under Erasmus, and Tyndale ends up using Erasmus's third edition to do his translation. He eventually has to move to Germany to complete his New Testament translation, but it is the third edition of Erasmus's version of the Greek New Testament that he used to do so. One of the reasons that is so interesting for English speakers is if you read a King James or a New King James, in 1 John chapter 5, verse 7, we've talked about this in some of the other lectures, you're going to see what's often called the Johannine or Johannine comma. And it is the phrase where it says, the Father and the Spirit and the Son are one. Well, that's in Erasmus' third edition, but it's not in the fourth or fifth, and it's not in the first and second, because Erasmus didn't think it was original to John. We told the story back when we looked at the text. We won't really tell it here. But the fact that Tyndale knew Erasmus and chooses to use his third edition has formed an interesting piece of English history, so that phrase was a part of English Bibles for a very, very long time. Still part of the New King James tradition. But he's working on his translation, and he becomes opposed by the Roman Church. They don't like what he's doing. He actually has to run away from Cologne with his partially printed New Testament because of persecution. He ends up going to Worms, Germany, and they're more disposed to free thinking, and they're more disposed to getting the Bible into native tongues of people. And then he begins smuggling his copies into England in 1526. However, the opposition just increases, and eventually the Roman Catholic Church is actually systematically collecting, buying, and then burning his New Testaments. Well, Tyndale in this time is continuing his work on the Old Testament, and he translates the Torah, and Jonah revises Genesis, but eventually he is betrayed and arrested in 1535, and then burned at the stake as a heretic in 1536. But while he is on that stake and they've lit the fires, he is reported to have said, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." Despite the fact that he is killed for being a translator of the Bible into English, he has several friends that continue on his work. So a guy named Coverdale, who is a friend of Tyndale's, produces a version of the Bible in 1535. Another one produces a version of the Bible called Matthew's Bible in 1537, which are revisions of Tyndale's work. In 1539, you have the Taverner's Bible, which is another revision of Tyndale's work, building on the work of Coverdale and Matthew. In 1539, though, there's another Bible also produced called the Great Bible, and it actually was a Bible commissioned by King Henry VIII. 3 years after Tyndale is executed at the stake, the King of England orders there to be a Bible published, also based largely on Tyndale's work, because each of these are basically revisions of each other, Coverdale being a revision of Tyndale's work, and Matthew a revision of Coverdale, and Taverner's being a revision, and the Great Bible being a revision of Matthew's Bible. But when Queen Mary comes to the throne, there's a great persecution against the non-Catholics in England, and so many flee to Geneva, and there they produce a Bible called the Geneva Bible, go figure. And it becomes the most popular Bible in England. It is the Bible of Shakespeare, it is the family Bible, it's the Bible of Jamestown, but it has heavy Reformation and Calvinist commentary. So in response, the clergy of England are kind of upset, and so they make up their own translation, still a revision of these previous Bibles called the Bishop's Bible in 1568. Now, it's important to also note the Reims Douay Bible, which is actually a 2-part Old and New Testament Bible. It is the Catholic translation. This is basically a response to all of these Protestant translations into English, but it's from the Latin. Even to this day, the Latin Vulgate is the official translation of the Roman Catholic Church. And so when they make translations, it's not from the Greek, it is from the Latin. Well, that happens in 1609, which leads us in the time frame of a very important conference called the Hampton Court Conference. This is where the King of England is looking to establish religious tolerance. There's been a lot of religious turmoil and struggle over the past years, and he's looking to help bring peace back to England. And so he calls this conference of these different denominations, and many of the different denominations are in support of having tolerance and peace. And there is a suggestion of a new Bible translation without commentary that might help unify these groups. And it's met with great support, and King James is supporting this. And so they divide this into 6 companies at this court, and they decide to revise the Bishop's Bible, which, if you remember, is ultimately a revision of Tyndale's. As it finished, the first printing in 1611, they start replacing the Bishop's Bibles in the churches with the King James Bible. This is one of the reasons why the King James is often called the authorized version, because the King of England authorized the revision and printing of this Bible. It takes a while, but the King James Bible does eventually replace the popularity of the Geneva Bible as the home Bible. And it's also just kind of interesting to note that in 1613, a second printing is done, and there's actually 400 mistakes that are corrected or variations that are fixed in the second printing of the King James Bible. But perhaps one of the most amazing details with the King James Bible in the history of the English translation is that over 80% of Tyndale's original translation, the man who's burned at the stake, is preserved in the King James Bible. Words we still use today in regards to the Bible and teaching the Bible that ultimately were penned and crafted by Tyndale as he sought to bring the ideas from Greek into English so we can understand it. But that's probably not the Bible you use today, as language has changed. And the reason revisions happen, as we've noted before, is either we have new documents found, or we have new changes in the language that require us to adjust the translation to match what's actually being used and how words are being used today. And so I want to run through a couple of the more modern translations, but what's interesting is most of these are still in the line of the Tyndale King James Version. So you have the English Revised Version in 1881 and 1885. If there's a split, usually that means that the New Testament is translated and then published, and then finally the Old Testament is finished and published as well. And it was motivated by changing language, but it was also motivated by manuscript discoveries. So Sinaiticus had been discovered, and Vaticanus had been discovered, and they were accessible and they could be used as part of the revising process. You had Alexandrinus that had been found but wasn't in England when they're doing the King James Version, but you also have quite a few other manuscripts that had been discovered. Also, there should have been more work done in biblical scholarship and textual criticism. They were better at reconstructing original wordings. And so there was a convocation at the province of Canterbury, and there was this agreement to work on this. So 27 scholars worked on this over about 11 years. Eventually, they're joined by 2 American committees, though by and large the American committees are ignored and their suggestions not put in, but this is what becomes the English Revised Version. And because the American committees didn't like some of the choices, again, these were not major issues, just word preferences primarily, they had this agreement that in several years the American committee could produce another version, which is basically the same with their preferences. That became the American Standard Version, printed in 1901. Still a great version, one of my favorites of the versions that I've gotten to read and work with. It's basically the same as the English Revised Version, and thus you have those same motivations. There's just some particular slight changes in word preference and whatnot between the two that the American committees preferred versus the English committees. A little bit later, you had what's called the Revised Standard Version. It was a revision of the King James / the American Standard Version. The goal was to have the best modern scholarship while preserving the literary quality of the King James. It took a while for it to happen. The initial idea happened in 1929, but the Depression hits, and so funds weren't gathered until 1936, and because of World War II, the printing is postponed until 1946, and so 46 and 52 are when the New Testament and then the Old Testament eventually come out. You then later have the New Revised Standard Version, and it was, again, motivated by new discoveries. So, New Revised Standard Version came out in 1990. You have the Dead Sea Scrolls that have been discovered, and those are beginning to come to light. You have other manuscripts that have been discovered. So they have a better understanding of their original languages. They have different manuscripts. Again, wording has changed a little bit since then. So they changed the paragraph structure and the punctuation. They were trying to get rid of some archaic language that was still in the text. They were trying to have greater clarity and accuracy. They also removed masculine-oriented collective language. So when they're talking about groups of people that included women, they would try to avoid using words that were masculine in nature. So the committee is formed in 1947 under Bruce Metzger, one of the most renowned, recently deceased biblical scholars of our day, and it was published in 1990. There's another translation called A New English Bible, and I mostly put it here because all of these that we've talked about so far really ultimately have their roots in Tyndale and the revisions of Tyndale. The New English Bible is one of the first really new translations, like an actual going back to the Greek and just kind of basically starting over. It was a big difference, though, because Tyndale, the King James, American Standard, New American Standard, Revised Standard, all had a word-for-word focus. One of the things that made the English Bible different is it had a sense for sense, or a thought for thought philosophy. The New American Standard Bible, initially in 1971 and the update in 1995, is a revision of the American Standard, again, somewhat motivated by discoveries between 1901 and 1971 and 1995. And it aimed to preserve the ideal of what a translation ought to be. The committee really believed in the ASV, thought it was a great translation, but we're trying to update some of the language, again, as well as take into account the new discoveries and scholarship that had been accomplished and found. Another actual true new translation was the New International Version in 1973. And it was somewhat of a response to the New Revised Standard Version. Some people thought that that was too liberal. Their goal was to be easy to read. Again, they had a sense-for-sense translation philosophy, and they thought the RSV had somewhat of a theological liberal bent, so they were trying to respond to that. The ideas began back in the 1950s and was New Testament was published in 1973 and 1978. And there are other versions or other texts we could look at, as there are so many. But if you have an NIV, or if you have a New American Standard, if you have a Revised Standard, a New Revised, or an ESV, I don't have it on here, all of those are solid translations. And you can understand the communication, the intent of God's text from those. I've had the opportunity and the blessing to get to study Greek and Hebrew a little bit in college. And what it showed me was the places where they differ, it's usually because it is difficult to translate. There are some really solid translations out there, and the places where the wording is a little bit different, it's usually because there is some ambiguity on what's the best way to say things. But when you step back and you think about the word from whatever committee or translation you're looking at, and you say, well, is that saying the same thing? And the answer is yes. When you look at the context, you realize the same thing's being communicated despite the word that is chosen. But before we wrap up, we do need to make sure we consider something else as part of this, and it's called paraphrases. I'll give you a definition. A paraphrase is a restatement of a text or a passage giving the meaning in another form. As for clearness, it's a rewording. And there's nothing wrong with paraphrases themselves. To preach the gospel is to paraphrase it, unless you're just going to repeat the same exact words in your Bible. And there are a couple examples. The Living Translation is definitely more of a paraphrase. The New Living Translation is more of a paraphrase. The Message is a paraphrase. And the Message is pretty clear about that. The Message doesn't claim to be a translation in the typical traditional sense. And so they can be helpful. There are some benefits. You can help simplify understandings. You help people grasp things that aren't making sense or understand words that they didn't understand. So there is a place for paraphrasing. But when something's being paraphrased, there is greater opportunity for misunderstanding or misinterpretation. And so I'd highly recommend a New American Standard or an ESV or even an NIV. Any of those three are solid enough translations that you should be able to understand God's original intent when he had the apostles, the prophets say what they said. And as we close this series, I want to thank you for traversing this content and traversing this topic with us. We pray that this has been helpful, and we pray that this will be helpful as you search to understand God's word and God's message. If you do have any questions or you have specific topics you would like us to cover or deal with, please let us know, contact us, and we would be glad to try to get to that. Until next time, may God bless you and your family.